So we're going to talk about measurements. Your favorite subject,
Yes.
and mine to be the anti, right?
Right.
But that's how, that really started with Stereophile with you. There were no measurements in the magazine before you.
It kind of started with me. Gordon Holt, the magazine's founder, had published some measurements, but he really never got it together to do everything. It was when something, I think it was serendipity. If he'd borrowed an analyzer or something, he would do some measurements. And then the next issue, he'd had to send the analyzer back, so no more measurements for a while.
Okay.
So when I drove from Las Vegas to Santa Fe with Larry Archibald in January '86, amongst the things we mapped out was, should we do measurements? And I explained, well, yes, because Hi-Fi News had done measurements of every product they reviewed. I'd worked with people like Martin Collins, learning what measurements, how to do measurements, what they meant, how to work your way through the thicket of all the measurements you could do to find what ones you should do. So we planned it out. We would start doing measurements in Stereophile once I'd got settled in. The next question you should ask is, well,
Yes.
what correlates?
You read my mind.
Yeah. Well,
The measurements are measurements, but the question, I before you say though, I want to say, just give you something to chew on, is correlating. Okay, a good sounding speaker subjectively measures well, but what about bad sounding speakers that measure well, or anything else?
Well,
right?
I'll get one point off my mind first before I get to that. While I think about that answer,
Right.
which is the first thing that you do with measurements is just see how competent the designers and manufacturers are.
Okay.
And, a basic set of measurements will tell you whether the manufacturer, the designers are professional, are well educated, are experienced, or if they are, not saying in a pejorative way, a hobbyist who's living his dream by making the product. So if you look at, say, I have my comfort level goes up when I'm measuring something from a German company, because the measurements are always well sorted. Everything is in the right place where it should be. Then there are products where it takes an increasingly longer time to measure them, because the first basic set of measurements shows that while some things are very good, other things are completely off the wall. So now I have to retest that product using a different protocol, different signals, or in some cases a different analyzer, to see if I get the same results, the same peculiar results.
Okay.
And if I get the same peculiar results, then I'm starting to think, it's always a man. The women engine designers I've known have always been really good. But this man is pursuing his dream, and he's got this thing right, and all these other things he hasn't paid attention to, and they're just wrong. It doesn't mean the product sounds bad, but what it does mean is the product isn't thoroughly thought out. And one of the things reviews must do, I've always felt, is point that out to readers. That it's like, you might like the sound of his product, but it's going to be maybe a little more exciting than you were expecting.
I like that.
Now, on what measurements show you about correlation for good sound? To me, once I've done that first preliminary batch of basic tests, then I'm looking for, with loudspeakers, what's its on-axis response? Is it flat? Is the first launch of the wave flat? Or are there problems with it? For example, if you've got a speaker with first order crossovers, you might find there's a flat on-axis response, but anytime you move even above or below or to the side, all of a sudden you get these holes in the response. And so, has the loudspeaker worked around that problem? The late Jim Teal always did. Richard Vandersteen did. John Bow at Spiker from 25 years ago knew how to use first order crossovers and deal with the problems that they have. Other speakers don't. Other designers haven't. I mean, when I'm measuring speakers that other reviewers are writing about, I'm looking to see, can I explain what they've said? For example, there was take the zoo. one of the Zoo speakers.
Okay, I know it well.
Herb Reichert, really liked the sound.
Right.
The measurements were odd.
Okay.
It's got this big
big
woofer.
You've interviewed Sean Casey, and
Yeah.
you know that he's not designing for measurements.
No, but what he is doing is balancing the things that the speaker does wrong very carefully in order to maximize what the speaker's doing right. And with the Zoos, I did the measurements and I thought I have to go and hear them for myself. So I took them back to Hertz, we set them up, and I listened. And while I could hear the things that it was doing wrong, that I had measured and knew were wrong, actually, if you could adjust to those, there was some very good things going on. The dynamics, the life, the presence, and it didn't sound too coloured. Talking about coloration, you had mentioned in your email when you were setting up the interview, as a bass guitarist, why are there no loudspeakers that can reproduce the sound of a bass guitar accurately? And I got thinking about that. Well, what bass guitar? Are you talking about, Jack Bruce's fuzzed Gibson from Cream, which had a very distinctive sound?
Very much.
Or are you talking about Jaco Pastorius's very mid-rangey sound? Or are you talking about Anthony Jackson's subterranean bass sound that he got on Hearts and Bones? Which of those bass guitar sounds are you talking about?
Okay.
And, if, say, you had a speaker which made Jaco Pastorius sound like Jack Bruce, if the listener, if that's what he liked,
Right.
he's liking something that's wrong. Wrong in an absolute sense. Yeah, Art Dudley wrote in a review in a forthcoming issue, if you have a speaker which sounds a Fender Stratocaster sound like a Fender Telecaster, that speaker has something wrong with it, even if it's doing really lots of things well, which this speaker did in some areas. But if it makes a Stratocaster sound like a Telecaster, or a violin sounded like a viola, or an oboe sound like an English horn, or Jaco Pastorius sound like Jack Bruce, I feel reviewers have to point that out.
Okay.
And I can point to the measurement reasons why they are saying those things.
My favorite cover of Stereophile of all time, I wonder if you know where I'm going.
The one with the carry and the Corel.
You read my mind, yes. If one of these is right, so it was a carry 300B amp?
Yeah. No, 805.
Yeah.
They used 805s.
It was actually, it was called the 805, but it was actually an 845 too?
Yeah.
Right? Okay. And it was a Corel something.
Yeah, KSA 300, I think.
Something like that, right?
Classic solid state.
And
a
big
classic.
letters, it said, if one of these is right, the other one must be wrong. That was perfect, because they could sound entirely different.
They
did. Could both be very pleasurable to different buyers.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that, and I actually repeated that cover line on our January 2019 issue, which coincidentally also had a solid state, which in this case was a Cambridge, and a carry tube amp. Because it's one of the things that I have yet to do in my retirement, is to do a real in-depth exploration of amplifier behavior. But I'm starting to believe that what matters with amplifiers, if they are powerful enough, if they are matched to the loudspeaker, is that if they have distortion, it not be too high. If they have distortion, it be primarily second or third. No high order products. That distortion and that harmonic mix should stay the same at all frequencies. That mix should stay the same as the power level goes up and down. So basically you have an amplifier which is doing its job and not changing what it does according to the demands of the music or the loudspeakers. There are not many amplifiers like that. I'll give you an example. The Audio Research Reference 160M monoblock, which we reviewed 18 months ago, had some second harmonic, but it did. But I set it up after I'd done the measurements and I knew what it was doing. I set it up. What speakers was I using? I think Tidal Akira's. That amplifier sounded fantastic, and I think it's because whatever it was doing wrong, it didn't do anything else different at different power and different frequencies. But it was, and the second harmonic wasn't too high in level, just enough to make the sound a little sweet, but not so much that it caused intermod and caused any harshness. And that was a tube amp. I was really impressed by it.
But do you think that tube amps that measure well start to sound like solid state amplifiers?
No.
They still
not
have
so
some
much,
tube
not so much.
something?
Well, I think one of the things with tube amps, I mean, the late Peter Walker from Quad said it years and years ago. I used to know him quite well. He was very much a mentor to me. He said, with tube amps, it's difficult to design a really bad one because it either it works and is okay, or it doesn't work at all. So you can't use huge amounts of negative feedback to fix a problem with your basic circuit.
Okay.
Whereas with solid state amps, it could be the open loop, what's called the open loop performance when there's no feedback could be awful, and you just wrap a huge amount of negative feedback around the circuit, and now it looks like it's okay. But inside is that demon that is nasty and vicious. Whereas with a tube amp, there's never a nasty, vicious demon inside, because if there was, it wouldn't work at all. It's for single-ended amps, tube amps, and some single-ended solid-state amps that puzzle me, because they have levels of distortion that are audible. They don't just sweeten the sound, they dominate the sound. So when somebody says, well, I like that, then I'm back to thinking, yes, but it makes a viola sound like a cello. It makes a Stratocaster sound like a Telecaster. It makes Jaco Pastorius sound like Jack Bruce. Why do you like that? And that's an issue. I mean, to get onto some sociology stuff here. When I was at high school, every week the music teacher would sit us down for an hour and he'd play us classical music. And he had a Leek sandwich cone speaker, a Garrard 301 turntable, I think it was, Leek 0.1 tube amp, and he'd sit us down and we'd listen to classical music. And I played violin at school, ended up playing a lot more instruments. When I was on the road, I'd learned to play clarinet. And I knew what those sounds of it, I had it beaten into me, what the real instruments sounded like. When I took up bass guitar, I knew what a Fender Precision sounded like, knew what a Fender Jazz bass sounded like. I knew those differences. I learnt them deeply. So I'm sitting here reviewing speakers, and I'm listening. Are the sounds of those instruments different from what I'm expecting? If you have one recording and they sound different, well, maybe the recording was made that way. But if you play 10 recordings and on every one, violin sounds like a viola, well, now you know something about the loudspeaker. It's doing that. It's doing it and no one noticed.
Now, this is a tone issue, is what you're...
Coloration.
Can you measure transparency? That quality?
Not as such. I suspect it's a combination of something which is very transparent. First,
well, let's define it.
Well,
I have my own.
That for me, Harry Pearson defined it first in The Absolute Sound. The feeling that you're looking through this completely clear window into an event with musicians and singers in a space. And what's going to dirty up that window? Well, first is distortion. Because as the music goes up and down, the distortion goes up and down. So now you've got distortion riding along with the music. Resonances are going to muddy the window, as with that mini monitor with a port resonance. The resonances are going to play along with the music. Noise is going to interfere with the transparency. There's something called modulation noise, which, when there's music, it's noisy. A speaker particularly is noisy. When there's no music, there's no noise. So what you have is the speaker is playing the music and there's noise riding along all the time. I remember as an electrostatic speaker that Gordon Holt was reviewing back in '87, and I found it unlistenable. And I asked Gordon, he said, yeah, there's something going on. And we listened to it, it's like every time somebody it was like riding along with the music. And apparently this electrostatic speaker, they hadn't sorted out the chaotic behavior of the diaphragms. So as they were going backwards and forwards, playing the music, they were actually going like that, backwards and forwards, producing this modulation noise. And both Gordon and I heard it and were bothered by it.
Huh.
And so there's three problems that mess with the transparency, but none of them but actually are transparency. It's one or two or three
Right.
or all of them.
Right. You know it when you hear it.
You know it when you hear it. This totally open window into the soundstage.
And what about any measuring imaging and soundstage capability of an amplifier of electronics or speakers?
Well, there's an acid test for imaging of loudspeakers. There's a dual mono pink noise track on the Stereophile test CDs. Same signal in both channels. You listen to it, and it should be an infinitely narrow noise in the center point between the speakers. If it's wide, you know the speaker has imaging problems. If it's wide at some frequencies but not others, then you think, well, that speaker probably has some resonant problems that are pulling the image wide at some of the frequency of the resonance, but not across the entire band. So I put that on the Stereophile test C. That's always the first thing I do when
Which volume? Is that one of the first ones?
It's on all of them.
It's on all of them. Okay.
Editor's Choice is the most recent one from 2003. Okay. And so, okay, put on the dual mono pink noise. What does it sound like? And if it sounds really, really narrow and it doesn't splash to the sides, that speaker is going to sound good on every stereo recording, because it's just like the pink noise should be narrow in the middle. If you play an orchestral recording and there's a trumpet solo that's halfway to the right, you know that's where it will appear, halfway to the right. Just without even having to listen to it. You just listen to the pink noise. People dismiss that and say, well, it's not music. How can you tell anything if it's not music? Well, that's not the point. I mean, my upbringing as a scientist was you do diagnostic tests, which will tell you what the product is doing before you actually then do it with music, because music is very complicated and changes all the time. I mean, I remember my finals exam for my bachelor's degree, I had a practical electrical engineering test. So it took all afternoon. You walk into the lab, they hand you a box with 2 terminals. And all you have to do is find out what it is and write it up. And if you have, you pass. And if you don't, you fail. And so, you're faced with a box and it's got 2 terminals, and you have to think, well, how do I find out what it is and what it does? So in the 3 hours, that's what I did. Every review I do is the same process. I take a box, some of them very pretty, some are not. It has input terminals and it has an output, which is drive units if it's a speaker or whatever if it's an amplifier. I have to determine what is it, and what does it do, and how do I find out? And that's what the measure in me does. Recreate my finals exam back in 72. Handing the box, 2 terminals, what is it, what does it do?
But for the speaker example, right, wouldn't it, the speaker's placement in the room, the furnishings in the room,
of course, yes,
are all going to play havoc with that pretty little center thing, right?
Well, I mean, Gordon Holt was the first person who came up with this tip, is sit in your listening chair, get your friend, if you have a friend, audiophiles tend to be solitary people, and have him talk where you think you're going to put your speakers.
Okay. Yeah.
And if, as he walks around the room talking, just make a note of where it sounds most natural. Okay, that's
his natural voice.
Yes, that's the starting point for where you're going to put your speakers.
Right.
As I said, Gordon Holt was the first person I ever read describing that test. And then, of course, you did a video on setting up speakers, right?
Yeah.
There's work involved.
Getting close is always a good start.
And when they're 159 pound speakers, after a while you think, am I really interested in getting the exact right spot? I mean, with speakers, you can move them half an inch.
Yeah.
And yes, the upper bass is a little better, but the low bass has now disappeared. And the mid-range is still good, but the stereo image is still not, that pink noise still isn't quite where it should be. So, it's an iterative process, setting speakers up in the room. Only once you've got them set up properly can you then start doing what's it doing, how do I tell?
There's a lot of people out there on the internet, as you well know, right, who are measuring things, right, and saying, oh, look, right, but they're not John Atkinson
or Andrew Jones.
So conclusions about what they're measuring may not actually be relevant. They may be highly misleading.
Yeah, I mean, there's a speaker that's going to be reviewed in the March issue. Art Dudley's reviewing it. So I drove up. I happened to be going upstate. I was visiting Sasha Matson to listen to the Wilson Sasha DAWs in his place and to measure him in his place. So as he's in upstate New York and Art Dudley lives in Albany, called in at Arts on the way back, measured these speakers, drove home. Next day, thinking, oh gosh, something must have gone wrong because these measurements do not look right. So called Art, said, can I come back? So went back up to Albany on the train 2 weeks later, took a completely different measurement system with me. Different measurement microphone, different measurement system, different measurement technique. Because I didn't believe the first measurements and I was sure something had gone wrong. Read the measurements, they're the same, even though everything is different. Okay. Anyway, then the manufacturer says, oh, there was a manufacturing fault. So I went up to Albany a third time, taking 2 measurement systems with me to do more measurements. Yeah, so, you know, I like Andrew Jones. I suspect the test gear, or I suspect me as a tester. I've done something wrong. I've forgotten to plug it in or something.
Right.
Yeah, so, yeah, you have to keep looking over your shoulder, checking what you're doing, double checking, triple checking. I was having a discussion with Jim Austin just before Christmas about a preamplifier which had a specific problem. And so he said, well, did you check it? I said, yeah, I checked it. I used a Naver analyzer. I used a different test technique, same problem. And he said, well, surely the manufacturer would have known about that. And I said, well, you'd think so. Anyway, he gets the manufacturer's comments letter and sends it to me. And they say, oops, yeah, there was a wrong line of code, because all audio products now basically have computers in them. He said, yeah, there was a wrong line of code, and under those circumstances, yes, it did that.
Nice.
We fixed it in production.
Oh, good. Well, that's what matters. Wow. Well, I just want to finish up measurements with one other question. I don't know if it's actually in the list that I sent you. Do you think that big speakers, really big speakers, have an advantage in terms of, well, let's just say sounding better? I'm just going to ask, I just want to tell you, my experience, and I know that you're not the biggest fan of clips, but, so I have these Cornwalls, these clipped Cornwalls,
Yeah.
and they have a 15-inch driver, and first of all, I'm not one to play really loud, so I'm not really coming at it from that point of view, although to see how they sound loud, I do play them loud, but they also sound really great at very late night listening levels. But I just find there's something about them when I do play, and actually I was playing the live Cream albums, and just the control of it was just so effortless. I could just play it louder and louder and I never had any sense of strain or anything. So how loud people are listening or not, do big speakers have an advantage?
Well, on the Klipsch, what you've got there is what a writer for Hi-Fi News, Rex Baldock, wrote in the 60s. It's a loudspeaker without any moving parts. Because at normal listening levels, the diaphragms aren't actually really moving. They are so sensitive that you're getting unbelievably low distortion because everything is hardly moving from its rest position. And that must be some of it. Listening level is an interesting one because your ears are not linear. So if you play quietly, you don't hear low frequencies as well.
Sorry.
Some loudspeakers will have some kind of loudness compensation built in. So as you play at one level, they sound right. You play at another level, you sound wrong. I used to love Celestion SL600s, but they always took some time before they started sounding good. And
you mean time like break-in time, or you mean?
No, it's like you start playing music and, well, oh, that's right, they're okay. And Martin Collins explained it to me. What's happening is they're not really properly balanced until the voice coils are hot. So when you play them and they're cold, they're not at their optimum. They reach a certain level where the voice coils are hot, you get a little bit of dynamic compression, and now the speaker is sounding like it should. There are mechanisms like that going on. Big loudspeakers in general, they'll go louder, they'll go deeper. But
that's their advantage.
And that's about it.
Really? Okay.
I mean, I bought a pair of KEF LS50 mini monitors, which I love. And in this room, providing I don't go really much above 96 dB, they are actually really good. You don't have the last 2 octaves of bass. You don't have huge dynamics. And the imaging, well, I could tell you a story. I was visiting Michael Fremo, who has, Wilson and Alex's, which are huge. And you listen to an orchestra recording on a Michael system, and it's big, and you've got this huge transparent window into this huge concert hall. And when I came home and I played the same recording on the KEFs, it was like a little orchestra in a little concert hall. Yeah. So even though there was no coloration, the imaging was perfect, but it was small. And I can live with that because I like everything else the speaker does. So big speakers can be big in their presentation, and they go loud, and they give you more bass if your room can handle it. I mean,
but even in mid-range,
yes, if you don't play too loud. I mean, as I said, I have a 1978 pair of BBC LS35As, and I drag those out every now and again, listen to them in this room. A little bit peaky in the treble compared with the KEFs, but imaging is always wonderful, and the mid-range is always perfect. But they do not play loud at all. So you want them to play loud. Well, get bigger speakers.
Get bigger speakers. I think this is a good place to stop.
Okay.
All right. To be continued.